Some photographs reveal their disturbing nature at first glance, while others become unsettling only when you learn the stories behind them. Everyday images that appear ordinary or happy and were not originally intended to be frightening now depict an ominous and disturbing eeriness when you know the backstories behind them. In this video, we will explore 5 photographs with tragic or macabre stories that are sure to give you the chills. The Scrawls of Trauma. This old photograph just looks like a child scribbling on a blackboard. However, looks can be deceiving, as the story behind this image is heartbreaking. The photograph of this 7-year-old Tereska was taken in 1948 by David Seymour, one of Magnum Photo's co-founders, and was first published in Life magazine with the caption, "Children's wounds are not all outward. Those made in the mind by years of sorrow will take years to heal." At the time, the little girl was in a home for emotionally damaged children located in Warsaw, Poland. Along with other children at the facility, their assignment for the day was to draw a picture of home. Whilst the other kids drew a normal square house with windows and a door, this is what Tereska drew. The haunting image of Tereska staring blankly at the camera, remembering her home as a tangled mess of lines, is both heartbreaking and haunting, and became emblematic of World War II. For over 70 years, the image was surrounded by mystery, and the identity of the real story of Tereska remained unknown. Although it was widely believed the girl grew up inside a concentration camp, and that is why she saw her home as a chaotic mess. But eventually, the truth came out, and it was equally horrific. It was discovered that Tereska was the daughter of Polish activist Jan Klemens, who during the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944 was severely beaten and had all his teeth knocked out before being imprisoned by the Gestapo. It's not known if Tereska witnessed the attack. After the incident, her mother did her best to keep Tereska and her sister safe. However, their home was destroyed by the German Luftwaffe, and Tereska witnessed her grandmother being shot and possibly her mother being killed. Tereska was hit in the head by shrapnel and badly injured, and her older sister walked her 40 miles to safety. But the trauma of what happened left her with an insatiable hunger, and her mental condition steadily deteriorated, and eventually she was admitted to the home. Poor Tereska spent most of her life in mental institutions, where she developed a passion for drawing, cigarettes, and food. In 1978, at the Twórki Mental Asylum, Teresa Adwentowska met with a tragic death. She accidentally choked on a piece of sausage that she had stolen from another patient. A sad end to a very sad life, and a reminder of the fate of some children during the war. Class of 1999. At first glance, this picture appears to be like any other high school photo, depicting a group of teenagers smiling and goofing around. However, upon closer inspection, it is possible to spot Eric Harris, Dylan Klebold, and their friend in the far left corner pretending to point guns at the camera. Just a few weeks after the photo was taken, 12th grade students Harris and Klebold would shoot 12 students and one teacher dead in a meticulously organized school shooting and failed bombing attempt at Columbine High School in Colorado, USA. The massacre occurred on April the 20th, 1999, when the two students walked into the school they attended and systematically gunned down anyone in their path. 10 of the 12 students were killed in the school library, where Harris and Klebold subsequently died by suicide. Harris and Klebold had planned the attack for at least a year and initially intended for the massacre to be a bombing. But when several homemade bombs they planted in the school failed to detonate, the pair launched a frenzied shooting attack. At the time, the Columbine massacre was the deadliest mass shooting at a K-12 school in US history. Sadly, it has since been surpassed by Sandy Hook and the Uvalde school shooting, although it has been theorized that similar incidents may not have occurred if Columbine had not happened. In the years that followed, with the advancement of the internet and social media, Harris and Klebold have developed a disturbing fan base that portrays them as heroes for outcasts and social misfits, and their sinister plan has inspired numerous imitative killings, known as the Columbine effect. However, their misguided hero worship is misguided, as Harris derided the nobodies. Neither he nor Klebold were loners, misfits, or outcasts. They were simply heinous, cold-blooded killers whose motives for the killing remain unknown. It's hard to believe the two boys in that school photograph would go on to commit one of the most abhorrent crimes in modern history. Rodney Alcala. This is the deluded face of Rodney Alcala in 2010 during a court appearance where he bizarrely acted as his own attorney. He spent 5 hours playing the role of both interrogator and witness, questioning and answering himself, even changing his voice as if he were different people during the process. Alcala would often diverge into discussions about camera lenses, his hair, and his alibi, arguing with himself that his hairdo was different from the composite sketch. When asking questions to himself, he addressed himself as Mr. Alcala. At the time, serial killer Alcala had already been in prison for nearly 30 years and had been sentenced to death twice, but had to be hauled back into court with new murder charges, and despite his bizarre performance in court, he was sentenced to death for a third time. In total, he was convicted of 8 murders, battery, kidnapping, and rape, but it is believed he killed as many as 130 other people. Alcala is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his 1978 appearance on the television show The Dating Game, filmed in the midst of his murder spree. Here is a clip of him on that show, looking completely different.
I'm called the Banana, and I look really good.
Alcala actually won the competition and a date with the episode's bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw. However, she subsequently refused to go out with him because she found him creepy. It seems she had a lucky escape. A fellow contestant described Alcala as a very strange guy with bizarre opinions. Ultimately, Alcala never faced execution. He died of unspecified natural causes in Corcoran, California on July the 24th, 2021, on the 42nd anniversary of his apprehension in 1979. at the age of 77. For an in-depth documentary on Rodney Alcala, check out our Murderous Minds channel. Haunting last memory. This photo was taken in 1850 and features German architect Karl Weber and his wife, Emily of Stratford. At first glance, it appears to be a standard, grainy black and white portrait from the Victorian era. However, upon closer inspection, you will notice something not quite right about Emily. Poor Emily had actually died just a few hours before this portrait was taken. Karl requested the photographer as a final heartbreaking memento of his English first wife, who died tragically young. If you look closely, you can see the wires holding her in position, with her eyes forced open. In the 19th century, post-mortem photography was popular, especially among the well-off. Photography was in its infancy, and the long exposure times made it easier to photograph deceased subjects. Many wealthy families used post-mortem photography as a way to preserve the memory of a deceased loved one. Thankfully, post-mortem photography is now primarily used in private settings, except for cases involving stillborn children, and is mainly utilized in crime or medical situations. No laughing matter. This photograph looks like a couple of mates sharing a joke. However, this is no joke, and they had nothing to smile about, as the subjects Richard Hickok and Perry Smith had just been sentenced to death. The two men met while serving prison sentences at the Kansas State Penitentiary. Fellow inmate Floyd Wells told them about the Clutter family, for whom he used to work. He informed them that the Clutters had a safe in their house containing $10,000. After hearing this, Hickok and Smith made plans to rob the family after they were released from prison. On the evening of November the 14th, 1959, the two men drove over 400 miles to the rural village of Holcomb, Kansas, where the Clutter family lived. They arrived at the house in the early hours of November the 15th, entering the property through an unlocked door while the family slept. After the family were awoken, Herb Clutter was led away to show them to the safe, while his wife, Bonnie, and their teenage children, Nancy and Kenyon, were pushed into the bathroom. After their initial search for the safe failed, they bound and gagged the family. In frustration at not being able to find the money, Smith and Hickok killed all four family members by shooting them at close range. They then collected every spent shell before leaving the house with a pair of binoculars, a portable radio, and $50 in cash. 6 weeks later, the men were arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada, for the Clutter family murders, for which they were both tried and found guilty and sentenced to death. Hickok and Smith were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary on April the 14th, 1965. Hickok was executed first and was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m. Smith followed shortly afterwards and was pronounced dead at 1:19 a.m. Hickok and Smith were both buried in the nearby Mount Muncie Cemetery in Lansing, Kansas. Hickok contributed his eyes for corneal transplants, which were utilized for two patients in Kansas City later that day. In 2012, both bodies were exhumed as authorities hoped to solve the 53-year-old cold case of the Walker family murders using DNA. Unfortunately, insufficient DNA could be extracted to prove their guilt, although investigators have stated that Smith and Hickok still remain the most viable suspects.